I'm a Florida historian. That's where I started. And my first book's on the Highwaymen. And then I left Florida, and this is my first, true Florida topic and it's really not a Florida topic. It's set in Florida, or at least it begins in Florida. And, to you and me in the fence post, or to you and me and anybody else, I wanted Florida to be, and honestly, it's the South. The story, the Allman Brothers could have been in Georgia. They could have been in Alabama. They could have been in all kinds of places in the South, because these little pockets of music are happening all over the place. They just happen to be two supremely talented, driven individuals from Daytona Beach who met two supremely talented individuals, or met four others. Eventually, five of the six were from Florida or living in Florida at the time. So I had that parochial, provincial notion of the Sunshine State going into it from back when I was an undergrad at UCF, when I discovered the story, when it hit me. So.
Nice. Well, I went to UCF also. I have a master's degree in public history. So when I saw you had a background in public history and you're a public historian, I was even more excited to talk to you.
We got a lot in common, my friend.
It sounds like it. So your book was a great read, by the way. It was I love music history, and I love when people explain, the roots of music and how people are influenced by different aspects of music. Clearly, Duane Allman was well, I see that, of course, he's considered one of the, first Southern rock folks. So I want to start off just asking you, how would you describe Southern rock for somebody? Because, well, let me go back one more time and say, okay, so I love that this isn't just a Florida book, but it's not about Florida particularly, but since this is Florida Frontiers that I'm interviewing you for, I'll probably be mostly including his life in Florida,
Fine by me. So, I can riff on all of this.
I can tell. So yeah, first thing I saw was, okay, he launched his musical career in Daytona Beach, and his first band was the Escorts. So I wonder if you could tell me about that. But also before that, I think I'll just an umbrella question is, how would you describe Southern rock? What is that?
Yeah, so we'll start with that one. Probably one of the more difficult things I had to do in the book, because it here's the deal, and I'm going to get super specific with you. Southern rock is two things to me. In period, it's two things. It is Southern musicians playing rock music, rock being rock and roll, and then rock being music as art, which I do describe in the book. Less about the dancing, more about the performance. The Allman Brothers are the first Southern band to play rock music to break out of the South. Therefore, they are a Southern, rock band, right? Or a rock band from the South. What confuses things is by about 1973, 2 years after Duane dies, within the year after Barry Oakley dies, two principals in the story, two Floridians. I call Barry a Floridian, even though he's a transplant, like many adult Floridians. But the record industry, particularly Capricorn Records, the Allman Brothers label, grasps onto this term Southern rock, which in the book I use a capital S, lowercase r, to denote a musical genre that is very loosely defined, of a bunch of boogie rock bands with some country influence who stayed in the South, who didn't hide their Southernness. Lynyrd Skynyrd, Jacksonville, Florida, I literally the progenitors of the sound. Even though the Allman Brothers come first, Skynyrd to me represents that sound. The Allman Brothers, everybody always says they're different. Musically, they were the virtuosos of that entire genre. But that genre, Southern rock, from about 1973, when Brothers and Sisters comes out, to the early 80s, is it's huge. You're too young for this, I'm sure, but 38 Special from Jacksonville had hits on early MTV. We watched them and listened to them when I was a kid. That was the dying throes of that movement. MTV, I don't think MTV ruined Southern rock. I think eventually people just got tired of it. And it didn't evolve much. When you listen to the later stuff, it sounds sort of similar. It was a little more for the marketplace. So there's a long answer to your very quick question that I agonized over in the book, because the Allman Brothers, invented it, if you will, because they gave other Southern musicians a chance to stay in the South and make their music Southern inflected music without, trying to water that down at all. And then in 1973, they are literally waving the flag for it. Literally by 74, they've got the Confederate, the rebel flag they're waving. And that is a part of a musical movement that they are really part of until about their reunion and their second reunion in 1989-90, when they had the Southern Turns album, Seven Turns, which is, to me, their bookend Southern rock album. After that, they go back to that kind of psychedelic, jazzy sound primarily. They never lost it, but Southern rock sort of took it in a direction. Honestly, it's the kind of crap that only people like me and you, parse, right? Most listeners are like, it's just music. And so that's about the best I can say. And again, they were a band that broke out of the South as a band. So a lot of Southerners left the South. Floridians, Graham Parsons, Tom Petty, the two dudes from the Eagles, Bernie Ledden, and his brother Tom with Mudcrutch later, and Don Felder, Stephen Stills. They all leave the South to make it. The Allman Brothers tried 3 different times. Duane and Greg tried and failed 3 different times until Duane said, screw it, we're staying in the South, and we're going to do this. So that makes them the Southern rock band, except, right, their sound is nothing like what comes after it.
I noticed, of course, that, okay, so he's born in Nashville or whatever, but then moves to Daytona as a kid, but looked like 9 years old. So they're living in Daytona. And I have noticed that, Florida, I am always intrigued by there are so many musicians that came out of Florida, and like, what was it in the water in the 60s and 70s? Right. It was creating all these garage bands that were playing in these college towns and whatnot. So let's go back to Daytona Beach, where he launched his musical career, and his first band in 1964, the Escorts. And I saw that they were an integrated house band, right? Integrated band.
Well, ish. So let's say this. I don't think, again, it's the water in Florida. It's the water, right? So I've spent some time in the book on this, and I had a friend of mine edit this. We could talk scholarship and how all this works. I did all this myself, sitting in this space, doing it. And Sue Ferentinos, my dear friend, and she said, you need to say more about kind of what's going on here. So let's set the stage just a bit for, Daytona Beach for Florida. So prior to World War II, Florida has less people than Arkansas. Ponder that for a second, right? Florida is sort of populated, sort of around the coast and a whole bunch of rural, similar to what it is today, but lots more people. World War II, it really post-World War II brings an influx of people to Florida, mainly because, Florida promoted it as a, civically and economically. And a lot of veterans enjoyed being in Florida in December, January, February, the kind of time when it's really crappy elsewhere. So, and then the federal government, really had been investing all throughout the country. And that is what's going on, throughout the South. And if you look at where the story happens, and the story of Southern music in this era happens, it happens in these not suburban communities. Daytona Beach isn't really a suburban community. It's just a small town. The biggest town in this story really is Jacksonville, which is a relatively, big town even at that moment, but for them, and that's a Navy town, right? Daytona Beach is close to, the Space Coast and where things are going on down there. So you have that factor. Then you have the baby boom, which is a legit tons of kids being born after kind of some slow periods of life, right? And they have money because the economy is booming. So they are buying, for the first time ever, records for themselves. Now, this goes back to Elvis, right? But by the time you get to the 60s, what happened? The Beatles. And, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I have that in the book as a pivot point. It was a pivot point. Tom Petty says it repeatedly. That's one of my best Petty quote in the book, there was a way. So Duane gets hit by the music bug. It starts with Greg. He gets a guitar in the early, he's 60, 61. The timeline's a little weird. A neighbor of his grandmother's up here in Nashville, where I am. Duane ends up basically stealing the guitar on a regular basis. So Mama A buys them both a guitar, and they just go nuts. Fast forward to your question about the escorts, and that early on, it's very evident that they gravitated toward Black music, as did, by the way, almost all the players in this story. African-American music is the bedrock of Southern rock. It's the bedrock of rock and roll. It's really the bedrock of American music. J-Mo calls it jazz. And I think if you put a real wide perspective on that, it all sort of bubbles up from jazz in these different ways. Jazz is, I suppose, playing how you want to play at that moment, right? So they form these, garage bands and record some and are in some local competitions. And one of those, yes, is an integrated band. They back the House Rockers and the Untils. I can't remember which is which, but they played on the white side of town at the Daytona Beach Pier. And then afterwards, they would go to the black side of town and play. And some of the only, actually, Duane and his contemporaries were some of the only folks who were okay on the black side of town, or at least accepted. By the way, this is true of Mike Bloomfield in Chicago 4 or 5 years earlier. This is happening all over, I guess, is what I'm saying. That's why you can't say it's truly a Southern story. The factors that work out for Duane and Greg are mostly because they're just determined not to fail. You know what I mean? The South doesn't offer them a lot. Florida doesn't offer them a lot. They record as the Escorts in Daytona Beach. They hit the road as the Allman Joys as soon as Greg finishes high school, and go up to Nashville, the first place most Southerners will go and spend a summer. They cut some records, fails miserably. Actually, one of those is The Shapes of Things that, the Yardbirds sung. Jeff Beck just died. For anybody, I guess this is not a timely piece, but, it's they were very famous for always being beyond what anybody else was doing because of how complex they were. But they weren't succeeding. Records weren't selling. They later go to New York with the Sandpipers, and that doesn't go well. Then they go crazy and go all the way out to LA, and that just about kills them all, and that's where that determination says we got to come back home and do it our way, or I have to. It starts with Duane. I think I went a little off your track with the Escorts, but they were very, so, it's extremely significant. They're an integrated rock band, extremely significant. However, they didn't approach it with that. A lot of artists won't, right? We're not making a political statement here. J-Mo is our dude because he's our dude, J-Mo being the black drummer in the Allman Brothers band. But they were, yes, very familiar already with doing that in their hometown in different integrated ensembles as the bands would join up and do as backing bands and stuff.
Yeah, I was wondering if that maybe influenced their sound in any way, just playing with playing with black musicians. I wonder if you could tell me more about his musical influences and his musical style.
Oh, excellent question. First of all, yes, the question about how it influenced. It's really hard to pinpoint as a writer, as people speaking, right? Where do influences come from? How do they manifest themselves? To the early Allman Joyce tracks, in particular, they're very excellent covers of the original arrangement and material. There's not as much originality. It's real good execution. And that's what an early musician really does. You have to kind of learn somehow, and one way you do is by copying others. Duane and Greg both. We're listening a lot to the radio, a lot to WLAC here out in Nashville, 50,000 watt station that when you listen, honestly, got all the way down to Jamaica because Bob Marley was listening to it and was inspired with the Wailers and their early singing. And folks, Bob Dylan, all the way up in Hibbing, Minnesota, was listening to WLAC. So, and that is rhythm and blues music, black music. Jimmy Reed, blues guitarist, probably one of Duane's earliest influences. B.B. King, the king of the blues. He later finds Elmore James as a slide guitarist, and then his the contemporaries at this point in the mid 60s and up, you got Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck, probably not as much Jimmy Page. That's like that triumvirate everybody says. Mike Bloomfield is a huge influence on Duane. And I should say, and then Greg sort of gravitates towards the singers. Little Milton Campbell is his big influence. They all loved Ray Charles. What I'd say is what I say, WAT''D. I had to type that so many times, is one of the first tracks they recorded. So if you look, you can look at their, and I did some genealogy, if you will, of their repertoire, and you can kind of see where all of this goes. But just to say, Chuck Leavell, who plays in the Allman Brothers Band from 72 to 76, he's now the musical director of the Rolling Stones. Ray Charles was his guidepost, right? So when he joins the band, he's got those same similar influences. Like I said, this is that whole generation of rhythm and bluesers who are listening to that stuff. He doesn't pick up slide, which is kind of the thing he gets most well known for in his lifetime until 68-ish. And, you know, his big influence at that point, I guess, had started out being Jesse Ed Davis, who played slide on the Statesboro Blues with Taj Mahal. But he later then, Robert Johnson, you know, Elmore James, you know, those kind of folks to pick up slide as well. And then what Dickie says is he listened to a lot of harmonica players. And if you listen, I have done it a lot. I've listened to Fillmore a lot. And if you hear his sound, you can hear in that slide, it sounds like a harmonica blowing. So there you're getting like Little Walter and James Cotton and Junior Wells. Allman Brothers covered a Junior Wells song. And yeah, so I guess that's a, you know, pretty easy, pretty good way to say it. He had a lot of influences, and his guitar influences were very similar to what a lot of folks were at that era.
Nice. Well, if you were to say what set him apart from other musicians, what was it about him that was unique?
It's hard to pick one thing, but I'll go with what's sort of on my mind. What has been really bubbling up over the last couple months since the book came out. Duane was 24 years old when he died. He would have turned 25 a couple weeks, about a month later, I guess. His list of accomplishments is just absolutely remarkable. It's astounding. And his career was mostly in about a 3-year span, 68 to, you know, 71, late 68 to late 71, his career on the map. And here's the thing I always find really remarkable about him. He kept grinding because he had something here and here that he wanted, you know, and I think we're doing this audio. So head, heart, and in his hands, his guitar, that he wanted to do and say. He had a choice to do anything he wanted to by the time he had that contract in early 69. So for just a little backstory, Duane had failures in Nashville, New York, and then he'd gone out to LA with a band called Hourglass. For your listeners, look it up. You'll see pictures of Duane in a doily. And they're dressed up in their psychedelic finery, and it just doesn't look right to me. The music sounds good. Some of my friends like it, are always challenging me to like it more than I do. I don't love it, but they fail at their last chance of success in LA. He quits with no other options and drives back to Florida. And in September 1968, he records with the 31st of February, Butch Trucks and Greg. Greg comes back for a bit. They tour. And then he goes to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and weasels his way onto a session with Clarence Carter, all in about a 3-week span in September of 1968, and then goes back to Jacksonville to hang out and gets a telegram to go back to Muscle Shoals and record with Wilson Pickett. And that's what gives us the Hey Jude session, which really gave Duane his break. You asked me what's remarkable about him. Duane could have formed a group, the Duane Allman experience, like the Jimi Hendrix experience, right? Duane could have done just about anything he wanted to. And what his choice was to put together a band of equals. He subsumed his own ego and his tremendous talent because he understood his talent was best unleashed in an ensemble and in one where he was a part of the whole. And I think that's Holly, I think that's absolutely remarkable. And the reason I do, again, is he had an ego. He knew how good he was. He did. But almost everything I've seen says he was a really kind and generous spirit about that. And it says a lot to me that his choice was to pull 5 other guys together to do this ensemble thing where even when he wasn't soloing, he was still a major part of the story because he was playing rhythm or pushing things. Or what they'll do, if you can listen closely, and I'm a musician, so I can hear some of it, but you'll hear him pushing Greg or pushing the drums or something, or the vice versa, while Dickie Betts is wailing on a solo. I've got this idea in my mind about leadership lessons from Duane Allman, because I've been doing museums and leadership and all that for most of my life, most of my professional career. And so I've got that in, that's one of those lessons, right? Like, subsume yourself a little bit for the greater good and listen to what comes of it. And then the remarkable thing, to bring it full circle for you, to me, is the concept that he came up with outlived him by 43 years, for the most part, at that high level. Now, they had some dips. They had some personnel issues. There were times the music wasn't as good or wasn't as cohesive. But for the most part, he founded a concept that no one else had done, and they continued it in his honor, following that spirit. So, again, I think the two parts of it, one is how remarkable it was that he made this decision and how he did it. And the second one was that the band outlived him. And frankly, he found patronage. I mean, one of the things an artist needs to do is make money to live, right? So he found the right collaborators in the music industry, between his record label head and manager Phil Walden, Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records, Bill Graham of Fillmore East and West, and other things. He found the right combination, or they did. They captured the right combination in the right people.
Obviously, people know him for the Layla sessions as well. I wonder if you could tell me about him working with Eric Clapton, and that I saw his quote in there about he felt like he fell in love with Duane Allman because they work so well together. And also just curious, Lee, if Duane Allman were still alive, do you think he would be bigger than Eric Clapton? Because I kind of do. I kind of do. I personally think he would be.
So
seem more likable. He seems like a more likable person, honestly. Just more intriguing. I don't know, more handsome. He had a lot going for him. I think that he could have, not to, comparing people like that, but I compared them and thought, I bet he would have been bigger.
Okay, so let's get back to the second question is, say, for most, I'm pretty parochial about this too. Okay, Eric Clapton was like my first guitar hero, my piece of junk. Oh, I don't know where it is. My little original guitar. Like, I was playing Eric Clapton licks on this little tiny thing, well before I even knew about Duane Allman. To your point, I think most people would say Eric Clapton's peak was Layla as a comprehensive artistic statement. He made great songs afterwards. He was continued to do well. But, in terms of a creative peak, and the difference, right, was Duane Allman was there. So I think there is something to that for me. Layla is a great record. Duane is all over it. And pretty much everybody says Duane is the reason that record is sublime versus just great or something like that. It's got great songs, great playing, even the songs Duane isn't on. Again, another significant thing is Duane turned that gig down. He basically was handed, I don't know, $1 million a year. I don't really know what the number would be. 5,000 a week is, 60,000 orange, but it was a significant thing considering he was hundreds a week with the Allman Brothers when he turned it down. So, the counterfactuals are hard, right? Would he be, the other thing about Clapton, same thing about Bloomfield, same thing about Jeff Beck, who are, I think, at least Duane's equals at that moment when they're there. Duane is aspiring to do that. Is none of them worked in a stable group context. None of them did. I've been spending a lot of time with Jeff Beck in the last week and watching how the progression sort of works. And I think it worked out very well for Jeff Beck. Who knows how it would have worked out for Duane had he had to play out the string. Greg claims their drug problems would have gotten in the way, without a doubt. They were having problems. Success that happened after he died was just huge. And that messes everybody up, it really does. And back to the Layla session, Duane, it's a famous story and it's everywhere. So I didn't really tell it how they met, but Duane and Clapton met through Tom Dowd, who was their producer, kind of house producer at Atlantic. He Dowd produced Layla. He also produced at Fillmore East, and brought Derek and the Dominoes to see the Allman Brothers. I have a little bit about that story in Miami. And then they said, hey, come back. And there's a whole album of jams. It's really cool. It's just a bunch of dudes just sitting in a room jamming. And Duane stayed. It was a very short session. I think it was like 10 days and maybe some overdubs. He actually missed a couple of gigs with the Allman Brothers while he was doing it. The Allman Brothers still toured. And he was offered this thing. One of my favorite quotes in the book is J-Mo, who's like my spiritual, he's like the Allman Brothers spirit leader, you know? But he has the quote, forgive me, you can bleep this out. Do you have to bleep? Should I be careful? He says shit. Okay. So J-Mo goes, shit, Eric Clapton should. Duane came back. He toured, did a couple dates with Derek and the Dominoes, including in Tampa at Curtis Hickson Hall, which circulates. And Duane said, J-Mo says, he came back and said, shit, Eric Clapton should be opening for us. And, you know, that goes back to your story. I agree. I mean, I think the music the Allman Brothers were making in 69 to 71 is some of the most exciting music I've ever heard in my life. And still to this day, you know, fans that flame for me. I have never grown tired of it. I meditate to at Fillmore East because it clears my mind. And by the way, I can listen to all the individual parts and follow them through. Listen to the bass until all of a sudden Barry hits a lick that Dickie answers, and I'll listen to Dickie for a bit. I'm weird. I'm an obsessive, but you know, to me, that shows that answer that you said. Duane was not a songwriter. Clapton was a bit of a songwriter, or was a songwriter. Who knows what that would have done, you know?
I also wanted to say I appreciate that you didn't spend a lot of time on his death, because I did see what his daughter said about how, you know, people always start the story of his life with his death, and there's so much more to him. He's so spectacular of a musician that it's great that you didn't fixate on that. You did mention it, obviously, mentioned how sad it was, but you didn't dedicate like a chapter to it, you know. Because I want to think about him and his music, not his death. So I appreciate that you approached it that way.
That was intentional.
Good. I'm glad. And for in honor of his daughter too, because she gets to read the book and, you know, not see that and think about that and associate that with the book instead. You know, it's just a great story. And it also interesting that someone that young could have such a big, thick book written about him, you know, and so much information about his life, you know, and the details about his life. I mean, that in itself shows that he was a great person for people to have remembered him, and all these stories that people said about him after his death, and about how they, you know, what a great person he was and how glad they got to know him. Okay, so I want to know, while writing the book, what did you learn? Like, what kind of life lessons or philosophies, or how did that learning about his life and his legacy affect you?
I'm still unpacking that, Holly, in all honesty. So I turned in the final manuscript about a year ago. I think it was last February when I finally finished with the editor of the press. But I had turned it in for review about a year earlier in May of 2021. Okay, so a couple things that really stand out. And this is less about me and more about maybe my understanding of the story a lot better, I'll say. You know, I've always been intrigued by Duane's excellence, by his excellence in an ensemble rather than individual excellence within an ensemble. Those are things that really appeal to me as a human being. They appeal to me as a musician. They appeal to me as a fan. As a father, as a husband, as a friend, you know, everything else. I will say probably one of the big revelations I had, and this is going to take your question a little bit off track just a bit. I'm a fan of live albums. I think my first record was Cheap Tricks at Budokan. I was in like second grade. I Want You to Want Me was the big hit on the radio, and I bought that record with my own money. It's the first thing I bought with my own money. I don't know if that's why I prefer live albums or not. And I've later learned, and really doing this, that many live albums are cleaned up considerably in post-production. So first, At Fillmore East is a completely live record. I think that's astounding. That is like 78 minutes of playing on the absolute edge. And to me, that I aspire to that. I aspire to that kind of greatness. I am drawn to it, everything else. So that's part of it. But the bigger part is, what is an album as an artistic statement now? In 2023, it's hard to conceive of that because tracks come out, we stream, everything's available. For an omnivore like me, man, it's almost overwhelming to have all of this at my fingertips at all times. It is overwhelming. I end up going to the same things where I created my playlist. But Duane Allman, when it was all on the line for him and his band, they were going to break it up. They'd had 2 unsuccessful records. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars staying on the road. They were picking up fans, but there wasn't no money coming in. And then they said, what are we going to do? We're going to go and record on the biggest, most important stage of our generation. And we're going to do it all live. And then we're going to put out a record that way. So what was their artistic statement, right? Their artistic statement was a couple short blues tracks, really wailing on the slide, show off Greg's voice. A really great slow blues, Stormy Monday, a Bobby Blue Bland song that most of the bands of that generation would play some version of that slow blues or something like that. Many of them would. We're going to throw in some real jams. We're going to do You Don't Love Me, a Junior Wells song that we're going to take it to 19 minutes. We're going to play some instrumentals, and Liz Reed and Hotlanta, and then we're going to close it with Whipping Post, this 22-minute song written in Jacksonville at the Gray House up there at 2844 Riverside Avenue. So they basically put it all on the line for their art. So they curated this record, right? What a lot of people will say when I'll talk to them is they call it the Fillmore concerts or the live at the Fillmore. It was 4 concerts they recorded. Most of them come from the 2 nights on Saturday, majority of them the latter show on Saturday. And they chose this, right? They didn't just go up there and say, we're going to throw a bunch of notes and throw a record out. We are going to curate this document. So I started to think a lot about what artists and other people, even like us, right? This is my Play All Night's my artistic statement, right? It's my magnum opus. So I guess the idea of understanding that, interesting enough, Tedeschi Trucks Band, Jacksonville, Florida, came out with their opus this past year, a 4-album set based on Layla from Layla's perspective. It's what's really ironic because I've been watching Derek since seeing him at the Junkyard in Castleberry in the 90s. Was the decision I was able to make more sense of the decisions they were making with that record. They released it in 4 parts. They didn't release singles. They had and I was like, wow, this is how art is made and created. So it allowed me, it takes me a while sometimes, Holly, to go all the way back though and be like, all right, how am I approaching artists and their art, particularly today? I've rethought, and this came as a result of this project, how I approach new albums from artists that I love, like Tedeschi Trucks, Jason Isbell's another one, His Golden Messenger. I dive really deep because I want to appreciate what they're giving me. And I've learned that from this. And I think the final one, I think every author hopes his book is a massive success. I still do, I hold out hope, but more than anything, right, I want to touch people with the story. There's so many layers to what's going on here. There's so many layers in that book from me as a historian, as a Southerner, as a fan, as a musician, as a scholar, as a writer, as a citizen, as a traveler, that I touch on in there that impacted that book. But the one thing you kind of learn from Duane is he flamed out. He died at 24 as he was going. And I think most of us don't want to die at 24 when we do that, right? So learning how to pace it, I guess. I feel good about how I paced my life, rather than pushing this book out at 27 or 28 when I really didn't know my fanny from a hole in the ground. It has been a journey, Holly. It's been a journey through the pandemic as well. And I've had I put it in my acknowledgments, had some family loss during this whole process, which was, just interesting. But I think the endurance part, I'm always, this is a guy who just went to the line for his art. It cost him his life, but he was also kind of reckless about it. Like, I don't ride motorcycles. I don't cliff jump or, any of that stuff. I'm a wuss.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of seemed like he had a reckless spirit and somebody who wasn't going to be able to hang around for a while. I've seen musicians like that before. I think about Justin Townes Earl. I saw him in concert, and I was like, man, I don't think he's great, but he's not going to be around for much longer. And then he died like 2 years ago of a drug
Yeah.
overdose or whatever. So I was like, man, some people you just like can tell. I don't know how to explain that, but
Yep.
yeah.
I mean,
Um,
I come from a long line of addicts and alcoholics. And you know, it's yeah. You can tell sometimes, and then some people, Isabel's a prime example who pulls it together and kind of keeps it there. I know how fragile that sobriety line is for people, especially when you're in music where everybody's drinking, everybody's using something, or most people. It's a big culture like that. And I admire those who have gone through those journeys and have not, and are still able to function in that environment. Because I mean, it's an occupational hazard. It really is. And Greg's book, his autobiography, which, it's not a super deep book, but there's some moments when he'll really open up. He has a moment in there about heroin. Like, heroin is a musician's drug, mainly because it kills the time between what you're doing. And all musicians will say, right, I play for free. I travel. The money is for the travel and the hauling of the gear and putting up with all this crap in my life. I play for free. So what do you do to kill the time in between? Booze, heroin, cocaine, or pills are what gets you up for the gig. Then you got to do downers to get to it. It's a cycle. And I agree with you. Like, it's artists in and of themselves. Justin Townes Earle is a prime example. Are somewhat I think they're wired differently than I am, than we are. Although I consider prose my art form, I don't live or die for my prose.
we've covered a lot, and I'm so glad that you made a point to, point out his Florida connections, because people love that on the radio. I wonder if there's one last thing you'd like to say about him or his legacy, or anything else you would like to add before our interview concludes.
Yeah. So if you want more, I am on at Long Live the ABB on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, pretty much posting daily. And I'm also going to start a few more things there because I want to dive a little deeper in this story. So that's a little to be continued. And what I don't have hopes for the book except that people will read it and get a new appreciation for the band. I'm not trying to make you a fan, and I think that would be silly to do. But I do, for me, what I was trying to do with this book, and I tried to spell it out in the preface, I was really upfront about it, was I was so knocked out by this. When I was living in Forest Highlands and by UCF, I don't even know if it's still there anymore. I got this Decade of Hits CD, and I was like, holy crap, what is this amazing stuff? And it was like, it started this journey 30 years ago to say, what is this? And that results in the book. That's what it is. And what I'm trying to do is answer the why is this story significant? I don't expect you to love the Allman Brothers band, but I hope that when people read the book, they'll be like, I appreciate what they do, how they did it. And if you're going to listen and expand your horizons, please, by all means, I love it.